Hi, everyone. Today we're going to move on to our next topic, the biological basis for behavior. This is Unit 3 in your textbook, and today we're going to talk about modules 9 and 10, which are the nervous system and the endocrine system. One of the things we need to remember is, as Hank Green likes to say, though I don't know where it came from originally, is that everything psychological is simultaneously biological. So looking at biology, behavior, and the mind, when we look at why psychologists are concerned with human biology, we have to remember that every idea, mood, urge is a biological happenings. You love, you laugh, and cry with your body. Without your body, your genes, your brain, your appearance, there'd be nobody. So we kind of find it convenient to talk separately of biological and psychological influences on behavior, but we need to remember to think, feel, and act without a body would be like trying to run without legs. The heart, of course, is a symbol of love, but it's actually our brains that fall in love. Okay? So Dr. Franz Getz was a German physician in the early 1800s, and he proposed a type of study called phrenology, which is basically a study of the bumps on the skulls, and he believed that the bumps on the skull could reveal a person's mental abilities and character traits, which is what we see over here. I actually have a phrenology skull in my room as well. And he divided up the areas in the skull by the bumps of different faculties, he called it. It was completely wrong, but what it did do is it focused attention on localization of function in the brain and the idea that various brain regions have particular functions. Biological psychologists have made many discoveries about the interplay of our biology and our behavior and mind. Within the last century, there have been numerous discoveries, things such as the body is composed of cells. Among these are nerve cells that conduct electricity and talk to one another by sending chemical messages across a tiny gap that separates them. Specific brain regions serve specific functions, though not the same ones that Gall proposed. We integrate information processed in these different brain systems to construct our experiences of sight and sounds, meanings and memories, and pain and passion. Our adaptive brain is wired by our experience. Okay? We also have to realize that we are a system composed of subsystems that are in turn composed of even smaller subsystems. So we have tiny cells that organize to form body organs. These organs form larger systems for digestion, circulation, and information processing. And those systems are part of an even larger system, which is us, our individual selves, who in turn are part of a family, a culture, and a community. So we are biopsychosocial systems. All three of these things work together to influence. And in order to understand behavior, we have to study all three of them and how they work and interact with each other. So let's look at neural communications first. Neural communications basically how this started is that the information systems of humans and other animals operate very similarly. You can't distinguish the difference between small samples of brain tissue from a human and a monkey, for example. This similarity allows researchers to study relatively simple animals such as squid or sea slugs to discover how our neural systems operate. It allows them to study other mammals' brains to understand the organization of our own. And even though human brain is more complicated than a rat's, both follow the same principles, which all start with a neuron. Our body's neural information system is complexity that's built from simplicity. And the building block of it is a neuron or nerve cell. Neurons all differ, but are variations of the same theme. Each consists of a cell body with branching fibers here called the dendrites. Okay. that receive information and conducts it toward the cell body, which from there the cells lengthen into an axon, which passes the messages through the terminal branches at the end, and these terminal buttons are what releases the neurotransmitters. Okay? And these pass messages either to other neurons or to our muscles and glands. So basically the dendrites listen and the axons speak. Unlike the short dendrites, the axons could be very, very long, even several feet through the body. For example, a neuron carrying orders to a leg muscle has a cell body and an axon roughly on the same scale or proportion as a basketball attached to a rope that is 4 miles or 6.5 kilometers long. Some axons are sheathed in a myelin sheath, which is fatty tissue that insulates them and speeds up the impulses. As myelin is laid down at about the age of 25, neural efficiency, judgment, and self-control grow. And that is why, for most people, they reach their athletic peak in their early 20s because of that. If the myelin sheath starts to degenerate, this can cause multiple sclerosis, which is a degenerative disease where communications to muscles slow, and eventually there's a loss of muscle control. So neurons transmit messages when they're stimulated from signals from our senses, from our senses, or when triggered by chemical signals from neighboring neurons. In response, the neuron fires an impulse called the action potential, which is a brief electrical charge that travels down the axon. Neural impulses are much more complex than a computer, but they travel much slower than a computer. Like batteries, neurons generate electricity from chemical events. In the neuron's chemistry to electricity process, ions, which are electrically charged ions, are exchanged. The fluid outside of an axon's membrane has mostly positive ions, which is an arresting axon's fluid interior has mostly negatively charged ions. The axon's surface is selectively permeable, so only certain things can get through it. And when a neuron fires, this changes. The first section of the axon opens, the sodium gates are open, and the positively charged sodium ions flood through the membrane and mix with the negatively charged ions internally. And this causes depolarization of that axon section, which then causes the next channel to open, or the next set of gates to open. And this is like a domino effect or a chain reaction. Along the axon, not all the gates open at the same time. They open and close like a chain reaction, or like I said, a domino effect. While the gate, during a resting pause after the gate has opened and the sodium ions have rushed in, this is called a refractory period, where and this is when the neuron pumps the sodium back outside, and then the gate will close after it. And what this does is prevent the charge from going backwards along the axon. It keeps pushing it forward towards the end of the axon. After the refractory period, the neuron can then fire again. This process can repeat up to 100 or even 1,000 times per second, so it's an extremely fast process. Each neuron is a miniature decision-making device which performs complex calculations as it receives signals from hundreds, even thousands of other neurons. Most of the signals are excitatory. In other words, they push the neuron to fire, like an accelerator. It's like pushing on the neuron's accelerator, or like a car accelerator to go faster. But some of them are also inhibitory, which would be like pushing on the brake or slowing things down. If the excitatory signals exceed inhibitory signals by a minimum intensity, this is known as threshold. And once a threshold is reached, action potential is then triggered. So it's like filling a glass all the way to the top, but that's the threshold, but if you go past that, the water will overflow. Increasing the level of stimulation above the threshold won't increase the neural impulse intensity. A neuron's reaction is an all or nothing response. There's no 50% response. There's no, it either fires or it doesn't. It's like firing a gun. You either fire it or you don't. There's no halfway point to it. However, a more intense or stronger stimulus can trigger more neurons to fire at the same time or to fire more often. But it doesn't affect the action potential's strength or speed. Just like squeezing a trigger of a gun harder doesn't make the bullet go faster. So, like I said, neurons are either excitatory or they are inhibitory. They either speed up, excitatory, or they put on the brake, which is inhibitory. All right, so how neurons communicate to each other. The meeting point between neurons is called the synapse. Neurons do not touch each other, okay? The space between the neurons is referred to the synaptic gap or the synaptic cleft. And it's less than 1/1,000,000th of an inch wide, so it's extremely tiny. When action potential reaches the knob-like terminals known as the terminal buttons at the end of the axon, it triggers the release of chemical messengers known as neurotransmitters. Within 1/10,000th of a second, they cross the synaptic gap and bind to the receptor sites of the dendrites of the receiving neuron, and it fits like a lock and key, which I'll show you an image in a second. The neurotransmitters unlock the tiny channels, and ions flow in, exciting or inhibiting the receiving neuron's readiness to fire. Once the receiving neuron has been triggered, then a process called reuptake happens, which is where the sending neuron reabsorbs any excess neurotransmitters. Okay? So how neurotransmitters influence us is in many ways. Later in this unit and later in the year, we will look at how neurotransmitters influence things like hunger and thinking, depression and euphoria, even addictions and therapy. But for now, we're going to look at how neurotransmitters influence our emotions and our emotions. So a particular brain pathway may use only one or two neurotransmitters, or a particular neurotransmitters may affect behaviors and emotions, such as we see here, where we see dopamine pathways versus a serotonin pathway through the brain. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that plays a role in learning and memory. It's also the messenger at every junction between motor neurons, which carry information from the brain and spinal cord to the body tissues, and skeletal muscles. So when acetylcholine, is released to our muscle cells receptors, the muscles contract. When it's blocked, as can happen with some kinds of anesthesia, for example, muscles can't contract and we are paralyzed. Okay. Researchers found that when they attached radioactive tracers to morphine, to see where morphine goes in the brain, they found that morphine binds to receptors in areas linked with mood and pain sensations. Researchers confirmed that the brain does produce its own naturally occurring opiates, similar to morphine, in response to pain and rigorous exercise, and these are called endorphins. Endorphins explain things like a runner's high, and if you are a distance runner in any way, you know what I'm talking about, that kind of floaty feeling you get when you are running long distances or for a long time. It has pain-killing effect. It also explains the pain-killing effects of acupuncture and the indifference to pain that some severely injured people have because their endorphins are so strong, the brain is protecting the person from that pain. Okay. These are some of the neurotransmitters you need to know for the exam. Acetylcholine, we already talked about. It also talks about some of the things that happen if you have, for example, in acetylcholine, Alzheimer's disease produces ACH-producing neurons deteriorate, so there's less acetylcholine. which can affect memory. Also, too much acetylcholine can cause like muscle twitches and spasms. Dopamine, which influences our movement, learning, attention, and emotion. An oversupply of dopamine has been linked to schizophrenia. We can't say it's what causes it because we don't know if it's a cause or a symptom of schizophrenia. We don't know what causes schizophrenia at this point. An undersupply has been linked to tremors and decreased mobility, such as what happens in Parkinson's disease. Serotonin affects mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal. And by arousal, we mean being awake, not necessarily sexually aroused. An undersupply is linked to depression, and serotonin reuptake inhibitors are antidepressants that allow the body to create, or allows the brain to create more serotonin to fight off the depression. Norepinephrine, this helps control alertness and arousal. An undersupply can cause depressed moods. And GABA is a major inhibitory neurotransmitter. It helps our body from being overstimulated, which is why an undersupply can be linked to seizures, tremors, and insomnia. And then glutamate is our body's excitatory neurotransmitter. It's also involved in memory, and oversupply can overstimulate the brain, producing migraines and seizures, which is why some people avoid MSG, which is monosodium glutamate, in food, such as Chinese food. You'll never have an undersupply of glutamate as long as you're alive. Yeah. Let me see something. So there's several ways that drugs can I went too far, but we'll go back to this. So there's several ways that drugs and other chemicals can alter neurotransmitters. And drugs can either be agonist or antagonist. The problem, like with illegal drugs, or even legal drugs like morphine, or illegal like heroin, these opiate drugs, is that the brain, if the brain is flooded with these opiate drugs, such as heroin and morphine, the brain may stop producing its own natural opiates. And when the drug is withdrawn, the brain may be deprived from any form of opiate, which causes very intense discomfort and pain, which is why withdrawal from drugs like morphine and heroin is extremely, extremely dangerous and painful. Drugs and other chemicals can affect brain chemistry at the synapse by either exciting or inhibiting neurons firing, and these are agonist or antagonist. Agonists are molecules that are similar enough to a neurotransmitter that it can bind to a receptor and mimic its effects. Like some of the opiates are agonists, producing temporary highs for endorphins. What you see here, this is a neurotransmitter. It fits like a lock and key. This is an agonist that is similar enough to the neurotransmitter that it fits just well enough that it can stimulate the neuron, okay? And then the other kind is an antagonist. Think anti, it's against. They also will bind to receptors, but their effect is to block the neurotransmitter from blocking. So as you can see, it's not fitting like a lock and key, but it's blocking the neurotransmitters from being able to reach that receptor site. So it's kind of like a shield. So to give you some examples, botulinum is a poison that comes from improperly canned food. It can cause paralysis because it is an antagonist for acetylcholine. Botox, the Botox treatments, are small injections of botulinum because they smooth wrinkles by paralyzing those underlying facial muscles, which is why people who get too many Botox things look like they can't smile, looks like their face is frozen. Curare is another poison that also blocks ACH, acetylcholine, which is used. It's a natural poison that's found here in South America and is used by many of the Amazonian tribes in their darts to paralyze animals when they're hunting, to be able to hunt them. All right. Now, Module 10 is looking at the nervous and endocrine systems. We're going to start with the nervous system. The nervous system is divided into two main parts: the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and spinal cord only, And then the peripheral nervous system, which is all the other nerves in your body that are not the brain and spinal cord. Okay? So the peripheral nervous system is responsible for gathering information and transmitting it to the central nervous system, and then the central nervous system makes the decisions that is then sent back through the peripheral nervous system to other body parts. Nerves are the building blocks of this. They are the electrical cables that are formed into bundles, oftentimes, bundles of axons that link the central nervous system with the body's sensory receptors, muscles, and glands. An example of this would be like the optic nerve in our eye. The optic nerve is a bundles of millions of axons into a single cable that carries the messages in each eye to the brain. There are three main types of neurons. We have our sensory neurons, which are also referred to afferent neurons, which carry messages from the body's tissue and sensory receptors to the brain and spinal cord for processing. So afferent, like it arrives to the brain and spinal cord. Motor neurons, also known as efferent neurons, and I think they exit the brain and spinal cord, carry instructions from the central nervous system out to the body's muscles and glands. Between the sensory input and the motor output, information is processed in the brain's and the spinal cord's internal communication system via the interneurons. This is what actually processes the information that comes in and sends the messages back out. So our complexity resides mostly in our interneuron system. We have a few million sensory neurons, we have a few million motor neurons, but we have billions and billions of interneurons. The peripheral nervous system has two main components. Like I said, this is everything that is not the brain and spinal cord. We have the somatic nervous system, which enables voluntary control of our skeletal muscles, such as walking, riding a bike, writing, anything you do that's voluntary muscles, playing an instrument, okay? And then we have the autonomic nervous system, which controls our glands and the muscles of our internal organs, which includes things like glandular activity, heart rate, digestion, and so on. The autonomic nervous system is then subdivided into two basic functions. We have the sympathetic nervous system, which arouses and expends energy. It can, as a response to possibly fight or flight. If something alarms you, the sympathetic nervous system will accelerate your heart rate, raise your blood pressure. It slows digestion down, raises your blood sugar, and cools you with perspiration. You'll start sweating, making you alert and ready for action. The parasympathetic nervous system is the counterbalance to this. It takes over when the stress subsides and will produce the opposite effects of the sympathetic nervous system, conserving energy as it calms you, decreases heart rate, lowering blood sugar, kicking your digestion back in, as you can see in here. You can think of it as like a parachute. So the sympathetic nervous system is aroused when you first jump out of the plane and everything's speeding by if you do skydiving. But the parasympathetic is like the parachute, slowing everything down and calming you back down again. Okay, the central nervous system, which is our brain and spinal cord, as I said. The brain is what enables our humanity. It's our thinking, feeling, and acting. We have tens of billions of neurons, each communicating with thousands of other neurons, which create an ever-changing wiring diagram. With some 40 billion neurons in each connecting with roughly 10,000 other neurons, we end up with perhaps 400 trillion synapses, or neural networks. These are places where neurons kind of meet and greet their neighbors. A grain of sand size speck of your brain will contain some 100,000 neurons and 1 billion talking synapses, or these neural networks like we see here. Okay? So the brain's neuron cluster into working groups called these neural networks, where the synapses all talk to each other. And the neural networks these neural networks with nearby neurons, which they can have short, fast connections, each layer cells connect with various other cells in the neural network's next layer. So this is why, if you've ever heard that term, use it or lose it, this is very much to the brain. The more you practice something, whether it's learning to play an instrument or math equations or a sport, you strengthen these neural networks in your brain and you become better and better and better at whatever you're trying to learn. However, if you don't practice or you don't learn it, these neural networks weaken. And if you go long enough without doing anything with it, the neural networks will actually kind of break apart and no longer exist. Okay? The spinal cord is a two-way information highway connecting the peripheral nervous system to the brain. We have the ascending neural fibers which send sensory information to the brain, and the descending fibers which send back the motor control information from the brain. The spinal cord is also the neural pathway that governs reflexes. If you've ever been to a doctor and they hit that place on your knee and your leg flips up, that comes from the spinal cord. It does not come from the brain. These automatic responses to stimuli. This illustrates the spinal cord's work. A simple spinal reflex pathway has a single sensory neuron and a single motor neuron that often communicate through an interneuron in the spinal cord. So no brain is needed for this. You could have somebody whose head has been chopped off would still have that knee-jerk reaction for a knee reflex. Another such pathway enables the pain reflex. When your fingers touch a flame or a hot surface like an oven, the neural activity, which is excited by the heat, travels via the sensory neurons to the interneurons in your spinal cord, which then activate the motor neurons, leading to the muscles in your arm. Because the simple pain reflex pathways run through the spinal cord and right back out, your hand will actually jerk away from the flame or hot surface before your brain actually receives and responds to the information that causes you to feel pain. This is a psychologists believe an evolutionary survival mechanism that is built into our biology. If the top of your spinal cord is severed, you would not feel pain from your paralyzed body below. No pleasure either, no pain nor pleasure. With the brain out of reach, with the body, there is no sensation and voluntary movement, but you would still exhibit the knee jerk but you just wouldn't be able to feel it. You would still exhibit the knee jerk response though. But feeling pain, pleasure, and sensory information, all that, to feel pain or pleasure, that sensory information must reach the brain. All right, the endocrine system. The endocrine system is our second communication system of the body. The endocrine system's glands secrete chemical messengers called hormones, which travel through the bloodstream and affect other tissues, including the brain, in our body. When hormones act on the brain, they influence our interests in things like sex, food, and aggression. Okay. Some hormones are chemically identical to neurotransmitters. The endocrine system and the nervous system both produce molecules that act on receptors elsewhere, so they are related, like family. But like all families, there's also differences. The nervous system, neurotransmitters travel much faster than the endocrine system hormones. So it's like sending a text message from the nervous system versus putting a letter in an envelope and putting a stamp on it and putting it in the mail for the endocrine system. However, endocrine messages and the hormones tend to last longer than the effects of the neural messages. So this might be why upset feelings may linger beyond our awareness of what upset us. It takes time for us to kind of calm down or simmer down. In a moment of danger, for example, the autonomic nervous system orders the adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys, to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, which also have identical counterparts as neurotransmitters, which are also known, and the epinephrine and norepinephrine are known as adrenaline and noradrenaline. These hormones increase heart rate, blood pressure, blood sugar, and all the same things that happens in the autonomic nervous system with the neurotransmitters, which provide us with a surge of energy and that fight or flight response like we already talked about. When the emergency passes, the hormones and the feelings of excitement linger for a while. It takes a little while for our heart rate to calm down, for our breathing to calm down, and for our feelings to calm down. The most influential endocrine gland is the pituitary gland, which is up here in the brain. It's a pea-sized structure that's located in the core of our brain. It is controlled by the brain structure known as the hypothalamus, which we'll talk more about after the October break. But the pituitary gland releases certain hormones, such as the human growth hormone, that stimulate physical development. It also releases things like oxytocin, which enables contracting associated with giving birth or milk flowing during nursing, and even orgasms. Oxytocin is referred to as the cuddle hormone, because when it's released when people snuggle up or bond socially. And this hormone, which is a stress hormone, oxytocin is, promotes pair bonding, group cohesiveness, and social trust. It promotes us to try to reach out to people when we are stressed. Pituitary secretions can also influence the release of hormones from other endocrine glands. This is why the pituitary gland is often referred to as the master gland, because it rules over the other endocrine glands, but it is ruled by the hypothalamus in our brain. So under the brain's influence, the pituitary gland can trigger your sex glands to release sex hormones. These in turn influence your brain and behavior. Same thing with stress. Stressful events can trigger the hypothalamus to instruct your pituitary to release the hormone that causes your adrenal glands to flood the body with cortisol, which is another stress hormone that increases blood sugar. And it creates a feedback system. So it's kind of the brain to the pituitary to the other glands, the hormones to body and brain. It's a loop. So the nervous system and the endocrine system are intrinsically connected. The nervous system directs the endocrine system secretions, which then affect the nervous system, with the brain conducting everything like a maestro in a concert. So that is the end of our first video lecture for biological basis of behavior.